You're standing on the bones of the ancient world's biggest construction site. And nobody talks about who actually built it.
They were dragged here in chains from Jerusalem. A 1,000-mile death march, just to become slave labor.
Look at this way. Fingerprints pressed into the clay. Someone left these 26 centuries ago, and we'll never know their name. The empire crumbled. The palaces turned to dust. But what those prisoners wrote down is still read across the globe. Now let me show you what really happened here.
Walls 25 meters tall, gates covered with 60 tons of bronze, hanging gardens that defied gravity. Nebuchadnezzar's Babylon was the largest metropolis the ancient world had ever seen, and the labor force that built it came chained from Jerusalem. The story few people tell isn't carved into the golden palaces or the gleaming temples. It's in the calloused hands, in the backs marked by the whip, in the lungs destroyed by clay dust. For 70 years, entire generations of Hebrews were born, worked, and died raising the glory of their captors. And what they built was so monumental that archaeologists still excavate the foundations today, trying to understand how it was possible. It all began with a march. 1,200 kilometers separated Jerusalem from Babylon. It wasn't a journey. It was a death sentence disguised as deportation. In 586 before Christ, Nebuchadnezzar finally lost patience with the rebellious kingdom of Judah. He had already deported the elite a decade earlier, in 597, taking the young king Jehoiakim and 10,000 people from the upper classes. Craftsmen, blacksmiths, soldiers, anyone who could represent a threat or a use. But Zedekiah, the puppet Nebuchadnezzar placed on the empty throne, made the fatal mistake of rebelling. The response was total devastation. The Babylonian army besieged Jerusalem for 18 consecutive months. 18 months of growing hunger inside the walls, 18 months of desperation, disease, deaths by starvation. The Book of Lamentations describes mothers cooking their own children to survive. When the walls finally gave way in the summer of that terrible year, Nebuchadnezzar's soldiers entered doing what armies did in antiquity. There was no Geneva Convention. There was no codified mercy. There was only blood and fire. They burned Solomon's temple to the foundations, the structure that had taken 7 years to build, that had consumed 150,000 workers, that had cost incalculable fortunes in gold, silver, and cedar from Lebanon, turned to ashes in a single night. They melted the bronze pillars that Hiram of Tyre had cast 4 centuries earlier, each one 8 meters tall and almost 2 meters in diameter. They plundered every gold utensil that generations of kings had accumulated. And then, when there was nothing left to burn or steal, they gathered the survivors. Nebuchadnezzar didn't take everyone. He was too strategic for that. He left the poorest, the peasants with no special skill, to work the devastated land and continue paying tribute to a distant empire. He took the useful ones, craftsmen who knew how to shape metal, blacksmiths who understood weapons, carpenters who mastered construction techniques, masons, expert at cutting and laying blocks, scribes who could be retrained for imperial bureaucracy, priests who, even imprisoned, maintained influence over the people. It was skilled labor being transferred from a destroyed kingdom to a feverishly expanding empire. The march began in the still smoking ruins of Jerusalem. Men, women, and children were tied with long ropes, groups of 20 or 30 connected to each other to prevent escapes. Babylonian guards on horseback patrolled the sides of the column, whips ready for any sign of resistance or slowness. There were no carts for the deportees. Carts were for supplies and officers. The captives walked. The route went north first, skirting the central Syrian desert that would mean certain death. They crossed Galilee, passed through Damascus, followed the course of the Euphrates River south until reaching the Mesopotamian plain. Between 3 and 4 months of walking, depending on weather conditions, on the speed imposed by the guards, on the number of rest stops that were never enough. The heat during the day easily exceeded 40 degrees. The Syrian sun knew no mercy. The sand reflected the heat back up, creating a moving oven. The nights in the desert were the opposite extreme. Temperatures that plummeted. Bodies sweaty during the day, now shivering with cold, without adequate blankets. Water was rationed with cruel precision. Each person received the minimum not to die immediately, but not enough to maintain strength. Food was even scarcer. Hard bread, sometimes raw grains they had to chew for hours to extract some nutrition. The oldest were the first to fall. Legs that had walked for decades couldn't take it anymore. They fell in the middle of the dusty road and couldn't get up. The guards didn't stop the column. There was no time to wait for a recovery that wouldn't come. There was no interest in carrying dead weight. Whoever fell stayed behind. Children were next. Small bodies dehydrated faster. Mothers tried to protect their children by giving their own water ration. And then it was the mothers who fell. Entire families disappeared along that nameless road. There were no burials. There were no funeral rites. There was no time to dig graves in the hard desert ground. The bodies remained where they fell, waiting for the vultures that followed the column of deportees like patient shadows. The smell of decomposition mixed with the smell of sweat and despair, and the survivors kept walking, one foot after another, because the alternative was joining the dead. Those who survived the march arrived in Babylon with their feet raw, their eyes sunken from exhaustion, their bodies reduced to bones covered with skin. But even in that state of physical destruction, they stood paralyzed before what they saw. Jerusalem at Solomon's Peak had perhaps 15,000 inhabitants. It was a respectable city by Canaanite standards, impressive by the standards of the surrounding tribes. But Nebuchadnezzar's Babylon had 200,000 inhabitants. Some historians estimate up to 300,000. The outer walls formed a rectangle 18 kilometers in perimeter. Inside them, another wall, and inside that one, yet another. 3 concentric defense belts, each higher and thicker than the previous one. The outer wall was wide enough for 2 war chariots to pass side by side on top without touching. Herodotus, the Greek historian who visited the city a century after its fall, described this width with admiration, bordering on disbelief. Watchtowers rose every 50 meters, connected by walkways that allowed rapid communication in case of attack. It wasn't poetic exaggeration. Modern archaeological excavations confirmed the dimensions. Babylon wasn't just a city, it was a fortress the size of an entire metropolis. And all of this, absolutely all of it, was made of brick. Mesopotamia had no quarries. It was an alluvial plain, soft soil deposited by the Tigris and Euphrates rivers over millennia of floods and sedimentation. Building stone had to be transported from distant mountains, 300 or 400 kilometers away. It was too expensive, too slow, impractical for the scale Nebuchadnezzar had in mind. So, the Babylonians mastered another technology. They transformed mud into something hard as stone through controlled fire, and that was exactly where the deportees came in. The most basic, most brutal, and most absolutely essential work in all of Babylon was brick making. These weren't bricks as we know them today, small blocks that fit in one hand. Standard Babylonian bricks measured 33 centimeters on each side and 10 centimeters thick. They weighed more than 10 kilos each. Raising a single section of wall required millions of them. And the entire city was wall, temple, palace, warehouse, house, paved street, endless bricks. The process began in the clay pits dug along the banks of the Euphrates. Men waded waist-deep into the dark, sticky mud, digging with their hands and with wooden shovels that the mud constantly swallowed. They filled wicker baskets that weighed 30, 40 kilos when loaded to the brim. They climbed up slippery ramps of packed mud, leg muscles burning with effort, dumped the clay in preparation areas above flood level, and went down again. They repeated this from sunrise to sunset, day after day, week after week, until the skin of their hands transformed into one thing with the mud they handled. Pure clay wasn't suitable for bricks. It would crack when dried, disintegrate when fired. It had to be mixed with straw cut into small pieces to provide internal strength, with sand in precise proportion to control shrinkage during drying, sometimes with animal dung to improve firing and add fiber. The proportion had to be exact. Too much clay and the brick cracked into 1,000 pieces when drying in the sun. Too much straw and it disintegrated in the kiln, coming out as pressed dust instead of a solid block. Too much sand and it became fragile, breaking under any pressure. The Babylonian master potters had this knowledge accumulated over generations. They looked at the mass, felt the texture between their fingers, instinctively knew if the mixture was right. The Hebrew deportees didn't have this knowledge. They learned through the brutal practice of error and punishment. A batch of bricks that came out cracked meant whippings. A day of production below quota meant rations cut in half. A brick that broke under weight meant blame assigned to someone, anyone, and the punishment was exemplary so that others would learn faster. After being mixed in the correct proportion, the clay went to the molds. Wooden molds determined the standard size, ensuring that each brick was identical to the previous one. Workers pressed the mass into the mold, smoothed the surface with wet hands, removed the mold with extreme care not to deform the edges. The raw brick sat drying in the sun for days, sometimes weeks, depending on the season and air humidity. It had to be turned regularly to dry evenly, otherwise one side would be harder than the other and the brick would warp. Endless rows of bricks drying in the sun, entire fields covered with them, organized in lines stretching to the horizon. And workers passing between the rows, turning, checking, replacing those that cracked, always producing more to keep up with the insatiable pace of construction. And when a brick was finally ready for the kiln, the most dangerous work of all began. The Babylonian kilns were permanent structures built outside the residential limits of the city. There was a reason for this. The heat they emanated was unbearable from dozens of meters away. The smoke they produced was toxic, thick, capable of suffocating anyone who breathed it for extended periods. They burned mainly wheat straw and reeds harvested from the riverbanks. Abundant fuel, but one that required constant feeding because it burned fast. The fire had to be maintained for consecutive days to reach temperatures above 900 degrees Celsius. There were no thermometers. The kiln masters judged the temperature by the color of the flames, by the sound of the crackling, by the heat they felt on their skin when they approached the feeding opening. Workers took turns throwing more fuel into the flames, but no one could stand more than a few minutes at a time. The radiated heat burned exposed skin even from meters away. The hot air dried the eyes until they constantly watered. The smoke filled the lungs with particles that never came out. The fired bricks came out transformed. The soft clay had become hard ceramic, resistant, capable of supporting immense weight without yielding. The color changed from muddy gray to an earthy red that characterized all Babylonian construction. But along with the finished bricks came destroyed men, lungs soaked with soot that produced constant coughing, increasingly severe, until breathing became hard work. Skin burned by radiant heat, covered with scars that never fully healed. Bodies dehydrated by constant sweat that no amount of water seemed to replenish. There were no occupational mortality statistics in the ancient world. No one counted how many workers died per month at the kilns. There was no interest in documenting that. But any honest look at the conditions recognizes the obvious. Work at the kilns killed. Not immediately like a sword, but slowly, stealing years of life with each firing season. And the deportees, with no option to refuse, fed those furnaces just as the bricks they produced would be fed to construction. The demand never stopped. Nebuchadnezzar had grandiose plans bordering on megalomania. It wasn't enough to maintain the Babylon he inherited from his father, Nabopolassar. It wasn't enough to be king of a large city. He wanted to transform Babylon into the most impressive, most intimidating, most absolutely overwhelming city the world had ever seen or would ever see. And during the 43 years of his reign, from 605 to 562 before Christ, construction was constant, frantic, insatiable. First came the walls, because a paranoid king with real enemies needs defense above all. The inner wall, called Imgur Enlil in Akkadian, was 7 meters thick at the base, not 7 meters tall, 7 meters thick. A brick wall so thick it seemed more like an artificial hill than a built structure. The outer wall, Nimiti Enlil, added another 4 meters of thickness. Between the two walls ran a moat fed by channels derived from the Euphrates, wide and deep enough to prevent any attempt at climbing or building assault ramps. Above the walls, watchtowers rose another 15 meters. Each tower was a small fortress in itself, capable of housing archers and projectile throwers. The distance between towers was calculated so that the arcs of range would overlap, ensuring there was no blind spot. No stretch of wall that wasn't under constant surveillance. It was military engineering taken to paranoid perfection. The base bricks were laid with bitumen, a natural tar that gushed from wells in the Mesopotamian region, and that the Babylonians had learned to use as waterproof mortar. The bitumen sealed the foundations against the moat water and against the seasonal floods of the Euphrates that inundated everything around. Workers carried the boiling bitumen in ceramic buckets, running to apply while it was still hot and malleable, layer upon layer, sealing every joint between bricks. Burns were constant. Hot bitumen splashed on exposed skin and stuck, continuing to burn as it slowly cooled. The screams of the injured mixed with the constant noise of construction. No one stopped because of a burned worker. There was always another to replace them. And the smell of bitumen, a harsh petroleum stench that permeated clothes, hair, skin, became the trademark of those who worked on the foundations. But the walls, however impressive, were only the beginning. The Ishtar Gate was Babylon's main processional entrance, dedicated to the goddess of love, fertility, and war. It was through there that victorious armies entered bringing spoils. It was through there that foreign ambassadors passed to have an audience with the king. It was through there that religious processions marched during the New Year festival. And Nebuchadnezzar decided that this entrance needed to be the most impressive thing any visitor had ever seen in their entire life. The final structure was 14 meters tall, flanked by towers that rose even higher. The arched passageway was wide enough for royal chariots to pass with all their pomp, horses 4 abreast, banners swaying in the wind. And every centimeter of the surface was decorated with a technique that elevated brick-making to the level of art. The bricks of the Ishtar Gate weren't simple fired bricks of red color. They were glazed bricks, covered with a layer of colored glass that shone in the sun like giant jewels. The glazing process was complex, requiring knowledge of chemistry that the Babylonians had developed over centuries. The brick was fired first, then coated with a paste of ground minerals and metal oxides, then fired again at even higher temperatures to fuse the glaze to the ceramic surface. Deep blue dominated the background, the lapis lazuli blue that the Babylonians associated with the divine, the celestial, supreme power. Achieving that blue required cobalt imported from distant mines, an expensive ingredient that transformed each glazed brick into an object of value. Against that intense blue background, reliefs of sacred animals leaped in golden yellow and brilliant white. Open-mouthed lions representing Ishtar, the goddess to whom the gate was dedicated. Muscular bulls representing Adad, the god of storms and the rains that fertilized the land. Serpentine dragons representing Marduk, the supreme god of the Babylonian pantheon, the patron of the city itself. Each animal was composed of dozens of individually molded bricks, each with the exact curvature to form the correct part of the relief when fitted side by side. The lion's muzzle was one brick. Each eye was another brick. The claws, the mane, the ribs visible under the stretched skin. Everything calculated so that when the bricks were assembled on the wall, the entire animal would emerge in 3 dimensions. It was work of absurd precision executed on an impossible industrial scale. Along the processional way, which extended for more than 250 meters from the gate to the Temple of Marduk in the heart of the city, there were 120 lions in relief, 60 on each side in rows that accompanied the steps of whoever walked. Each lion measured 2 meters long. Each required weeks of specialized work from craftsmen who spent their entire lives mastering that single technique. And each error, each brick that came out with the wrong color or cracked glaze or imperfect mold, meant starting from 0. And there were Hebrew craftsmen working on this. The deportees from Judah weren't just clay carriers and kiln feeders. Among them were goldsmiths who had worked on the ornaments of Solomon's temple. There were sculptors who had carved cherubim of gold-covered wood. There were craftsmen who mastered techniques passed down for generations within Jerusalem's guilds. Nebuchadnezzar knew this. That was exactly why he had taken them. Now those same men whose fathers or grandfathers had created beauty for Yahweh, created beauty for Marduk. The same skilled hands molded bricks with images of Babylonian dragons instead of Hebrew cherubim. The same eye, trained for proportion and detail, now served to make pagan lions look alive on the walls of a pagan gate. It was irony so bitter that some perhaps preferred to be at the kilns. After the gate came the ziggurat, the Etemenanki, a name meaning the house of the foundation of heaven and earth, was the sacred tower dedicated to Marduk that dominated the horizon of all Babylon. It was what Hebrew tradition would later call the Tower of Babel, rebuilt and expanded by Nebuchadnezzar over much older ruins dating back centuries or even millennia. The structure had a square base 90 meters on each side. 90 meters, almost a football field in each direction, and it rose in 7 progressively smaller levels, each set back from the one below, up to a golden temple at the top that few mortals were permitted to access. The total height also reached 90 meters, a perfect cube when considering the total volume. It was visible from dozens of kilometers away, emerging from the absolutely flat plain like an artificial mountain, like a geometric challenge to nature that had not placed mountains in that region. Travelers approaching Babylon saw the Etemenanki first, long before seeing the walls or gates. It was beacon, symbol, declaration of power, concentrated in the form of stacked bricks, and every brick of that mountain had been molded by hand, fired in a kiln, carried up steep ramps that spiraled around the structure under construction, laid with millimetric precision by masons working at vertiginous heights, without any safety equipment. A fall meant instant death. A loose brick rolling down the ramps meant death for whoever was below. The work was as dangerous as the final result was glorious. Herodotus, who visited Babylon when the ziggurat was still standing, recorded that the temple at the top contained a bed covered in solid gold and a table also of gold where only a woman chosen by the priests could sleep, awaiting the nightly visit of the god Marduk himself. We don't know how much of this was factual truth and how much was legend that Babylonian priests told to impress foreign visitors and reinforce their own power. But we know the structure was real because the foundations are still there, excavated by German archaeologists between 1899 and 1917. And while the bricks rose toward the sky, water descended toward the neighborhoods. Babylon depended on a canal system that would be impressive in any era of human history. The Euphrates River crossed the city, dividing it into 2 halves, connected by a stone bridge that was an engineering marvel in itself. Secondary canals branched to all neighborhoods of the city, bringing fresh water for drinking and cooking, carrying away the human and animal waste that would otherwise transform the metropolis into a focus of pestilence. Bronze gates controlled the flow at each junction, opening and closing as needed, regulating the amount of water each section received. Keeping this system functioning required constant, permanent work, with no possibility of pause. The canals silted up with sediments that the Euphrates brought from distant mountains. They had to be dredged regularly, men descending into the murky, cold water to dig the bottom with manual tools, lifting baskets of mud that were dumped on the banks. The gates jammed with corrosion of bronze in constant contact with water. They needed permanent maintenance, lubrication, replacement when the mechanisms failed beyond repair. And when the annual floods came, when the Euphrates swelled with snowmelt from the Armenian mountains, the entire system was tested to its absolute limit. The Hebrews worked on this too, not just on the main city canals, but on the irrigation canals that extended for kilometers across the agricultural plain around it. The prophet Ezekiel, deported in the first wave of 597 before Christ, a decade before Jerusalem's final destruction, records his visions on the banks of the Chebar River. It wasn't the main Euphrates, it was an irrigation canal in the Nippur region, about 100 kilometers south of Babylon, where a significant community of exiles had been established to work the land. The very name Chebar probably derives from the Akkadian Nahar Kabari, meaning something like Great Canal or Main Canal. It was hydraulic infrastructure, and where there was hydraulic infrastructure in Mesopotamia, there was constant maintenance work. Ezekiel may have spent his days dredging mud and repairing dikes before sitting by the water's edge at dusk, too exhausted for anything but contemplating the distant horizon. And it was in that state of exhaustion and dislocation that the visions came. The throne of God on wheels of fire, the four-faced cherubim, the celestial temple measured span by span, visions of divine glory for a man who spent his days stuck in Babylonian mud. But they weren't just canals for water. They were canals for commercial transport. Babylon was an economic center that received goods from all the known world and from regions beyond common knowledge. Cedar wood from Lebanon came on barges down the Euphrates, raw metals from Anatolia, dyed fabrics from Phoenicia, aromatic spices from Arabia, ivory and gold from Africa crossing through Egypt, lapis lazuli from Afghanistan, precious blue that colored the bricks of the Ishtar Gate. All of this arrived in boats that navigated the city's internal canals, unloading at ports distributed throughout the commercial districts. The deportees worked at the ports too, loading and unloading goods that weighed more than a man should carry, storing in warehouses that had to be organized with precision so that royal inspectors could find any item on demand, taking inventory on clay tablets, recording entries and exits, because Babylonian bureaucracy was meticulous and punishment for accounting errors was severe. And when they weren't doing that, they were building more warehouses, more storage facilities, more infrastructure for a city that never stopped growing, never stopped consuming, never stopped demanding. And there were the gardens. The hanging gardens of Babylon made the list of the 7 wonders of the ancient world, compiled by Greek writers centuries later. But to this day, historians and archaeologists debate whether they actually existed in Babylon or were confused with documented gardens in Nineveh, capital of the earlier Assyrian Empire. No Babylonian text contemporary with Nebuchadnezzar mentions hanging gardens. No archaeological excavation has found foundations matching the descriptions. The first reference comes from Greek writers who never visited the city in its prime. But the tradition is too persistent to ignore completely. Some extraordinary structure must have existed to generate centuries of legends. The classic description speaks of elevated terraces supported by stone columns, each level planted with large trees and exotic flowers, irrigated by a system that pumped water from the river to the top of the structure. The total height supposedly rivaled the city walls themselves, creating an artificial green mountain in the middle of the desert plain. The vegetation was dense enough that from afar it looked like a natural hill emerging from the urban center. Impossible and therefore divine. The most popular legend says that Nebuchadnezzar ordered the gardens built for his wife, Amytis, a Median princess he had married as part of a political alliance with the kingdom of Media to the east. Amytis supposedly missed the forested hills of her homeland, covered with forests and cut by streams. The Mesopotamian plain was the opposite of all that. Flat as far as the eye could see, arid for most of the year, without a single natural elevation on the horizon. The gardens would be a piece of Persian mountain transplanted to the heart of the desert, a love gift from a conqueror to the woman he wanted to impress. If this is true, then anyone can calculate what it meant to keep these gardens alive under the Babylonian sun. Each plant needed daily water in the Mesopotamian heat. There were no electric pumps. There was no pressurized plumbing. The water rose by some mechanical system powered by human or animal force. The most accepted theory involves Archimedes screws, inclined cylinders with internal spirals that raise water as they turn, or chains of buckets attached to wheels, each bucket filling at the bottom, rising full, emptying at the top, descending empty to fill again. Whatever the mechanism, it had to work day and night without stopping. A week without irrigation in the Babylonian summer, and the plants died. Months of work and fortunes in imported plants, all lost. And the plants weren't native to the region. They had to be brought from far away, from completely different climates, transplanted with extreme care, slowly acclimated to an environment that tried to kill them every day of excessive heat. Specialized gardeners cared for the cultivation, watching each leaf for signs of disease or stress. Manual laborers did the heavy maintenance, carrying fertile soil to the terraces, pruning dead branches, removing pests that appeared from who knows where. It was an entire army of people dedicated to keeping a royal whim alive against all natural odds. 70 years. That was the period that Jeremiah's prophecy had established for the exile, even before Jerusalem's destruction. 70 full years you will serve the king of Babylon. And during those 70 years, entire generations of Hebrews were born, grew up, worked, aged, and died in Babylon without ever seeing the land their fathers called promised. Those who came from Jerusalem still remembered. They remembered the temple in flames, columns of smoke rising to the sky like an inverted sacrifice. They remembered David's walls falling stone by stone under Babylonian battering rams. They remembered the bodies in the streets, neighbors who had died of hunger during the siege, others who had died by the sword when the defenses gave way. They remembered the smell of blood and fire that had been the last sensory memory of Jerusalem. They carried that trauma in every fiber of their body, in every nightmare that woke them sweating in the middle of the night. But their children knew only stories. Stories told in low voices after work, when families gathered in their modest homes in the neighborhoods designated for foreigners. Stories of a glorious temple their grandfather had seen, of rituals their great-grandfather had participated in, of a city called Jerusalem somewhere to the west, beyond the desert, beyond the reach of any possible escape. For children born in exile, Jerusalem was as real as the stories of the patriarchs, as distant as Abraham leaving Ur, as mythological as the parting of the Red Sea. And their grandchildren, born of parents who had themselves been born in exile, knew only Babylon. They spoke Aramaic as their everyday language, the commercial language of the empire, the language everyone needed to speak to work, buy, sell, survive. They learned Hebrew as a sacred language, to read the texts that priests and scribes preserved with obsessive care. They wore Babylonian clothes because those were the clothes available in the market. They ate Babylonian food because those were the ingredients available. They worked on Babylonian projects because there was no other option for sustenance. They were Hebrews by ancestral memory, Babylonians by daily reality, exiles by definition of a condition that had lasted longer than any of them had lived. Psalm 137 captures that moment with pain that crosses 3 millennia and still makes the heart clench. By the rivers of Babylon, there we sat down and wept when we remembered Zion. On the willows there we hung our harps, for there those who carried us away captive asked of us a song. Those who tormented us asked for mirth. Sing us one of the songs of Zion, they said. The captors wanted entertainment. They wanted the Hebrews, famous for their musical tradition, to sing the songs of the destroyed temple, the songs of feast and celebration that the Levites intoned at the great festivals. It was calculated humiliation, asking slaves to sing songs of joy, to entertain the masters who destroyed everything those songs celebrated. And the psalmist's response is devastating in its refusal. How shall we sing the Lord's songs in a foreign land? But they sang, not the songs the captors wanted, but others. Songs of lament that became a permanent part of the liturgy. Songs of hope whispered when the guards weren't listening. Songs that kept identity alive when everything conspired to dissolve it into the anonymous mass of the empire. And more important than the songs, they wrote, the Babylonian exile was the most productive period of Hebrew literature after Solomon's reign. Without a temple to perform sacrifices, without an altar to burn offerings, without a functioning priesthood in the traditional way, the written word gained absolute centrality. Priests who once administered rituals of blood and smoke now became guardians of texts that were the only portable thing of the faith. Scribes copied the Torah scrolls with obsessive meticulousness, counting every letter, verifying every word, preserving every detail, because every detail was sacred. It was probably during the exile that the Pentateuch gained its final edited form, that the historical books from Joshua to Kings were compiled and organized into continuous narrative, that the earlier prophets were collected and preserved as a collection. The despair of losing the land produced the fierce determination never to lose the history. If they couldn't inhabit Jerusalem physically, they would inhabit Jerusalem textually. If they couldn't sacrifice in the stone temple, they would preserve the temple in words that no army could burn. Ezekiel had his visions on the banks of the Chebar Canal. The celestial temple he describes in the final chapters of his book, with precise measurements of every gateway and every chamber and every altar, was a temple that existed only in God's mind and in the prophet's text. They couldn't build it physically in the land of exile, so they built it in words, and those words survived when Nebuchadnezzar's palaces turned to dust. Daniel, according to the book that bears his name, served in Nebuchadnezzar's own court. He interpreted dreams that no Babylonian wise man could interpret. He survived the lion's den when his enemies plotted his destruction. He saw empires rising and falling in apocalyptic visions that are still studied and debated 3 millennia later. And he recorded everything in text that mixes Hebrew and Aramaic, the two languages of a man who lived between two worlds. The Aramaic chapters of Daniel show someone navigating cultures with skill that few possessed, serving pagan kings with competence that made him indispensable, but never abandoning the ancestral faith that defined who he really was, refusing food from the royal table that would violate the purity laws, praying 3 times a day with windows open toward Jerusalem, even when that meant a death sentence. It was impossible balance maintained for decades, serving Babylon without becoming Babylonian. And so the years passed. Nebuchadnezzar died in 562 before Christ after 43 years building his empire and his city. His successors were weak, unstable, incapable of maintaining what he had created. His son, evil Merodach, reigned only 2 years before being assassinated. His son-in-law, Neriglissar, reigned 4 years. His grandson, Labashi-Marduk, was killed after months on the throne by a conspiracy that put Nabonidus in power, a man who wasn't from the royal family and who spent more time in distant oases, worshipping the moon god Sin, than governing his own empire. The Babylon the Hebrews had built was beginning to crack from within. In 539 before Christ, Cyrus of Persia marched against Babylon with an army that made Nebuchadnezzar's look modest. But the conquest didn't come through the strength of the walls that generations of slaves had raised. It came through the water that ran beneath them. On the night Daniel interpreted the writing on the wall during Belshazzar's feast, Persian engineers were diverting the course of the Euphrates. They dug channels that drained the riverbed where it passed under the walls. When the level dropped enough, soldiers walked in where before there had been water too deep to cross. The impenetrable walls were useless. The moat that should have prevented attacks dried up in a single night. The most protected city in the world fell without significant battle. Cyrus entered Babylon as a liberator, not a conqueror. It was his brilliant political strategy. Instead of destroying and deporting as Assyrians and Babylonians did, he restored and repatriated. He ordered the statues of gods that Nebuchadnezzar had taken from conquered temples to be returned. He ordered sanctuaries that previous empires had demolished to be rebuilt. And in 538 before Christ, he issued a decree that is preserved in the Cyrus cylinder and mentioned in the book of Ezra. The Jews could return home. They could rebuild their temple. The sacred utensils that Nebuchadnezzar had stolen would be returned. Whoever wanted to go, could go. Of those originally deported, few were still alive. 70 years is more than a human generation. But their children and grandchildren, born in exile, now had permission to see the land they knew only from stories. It wasn't forced exodus. Many chose to stay. Babylon had become home, however strange that seemed. They had established businesses, accumulated property, built relationship networks over decades. Going to Jerusalem meant starting from scratch in a place they had never seen. But some went. About 50,000 people, according to Ezra's records, made the journey back. They carried Babylonian tools they had learned to use, construction techniques they had mastered at imperial work sites, knowledge of irrigation and agriculture they had acquired working on Mesopotamia's canals and fields, and Babylonian memories that would never completely disappear. Because 70 years of immersion in a culture leaves marks that generations don't erase. When they arrived at the hill where Solomon's temple had stood, they found only burned stones and weeds growing among the ruins. The city their grandparents described as the glory of the nations was a field of rubble inhabited by strangers who had occupied the empty land. The contrast with the Babylon they had left was devastating. There, palaces of glazed brick. Here, stones blackened by the smoke of fires that had burned 70 years before and never been extinguished. They had spent 70 years building the most spectacular city in the world for their captors. Now they had to rebuild their own from scratch, with hands calloused by the work they had done for Nebuchadnezzar. Nebuchadnezzar's Babylon lasted less than a century after his death. The empire he had consolidated dissolved under weak kings and external threats. The Persians entered through the diverted channels of the Euphrates, and those colossal walls prevented nothing. The hanging gardens, if they existed, dried up without the constant maintenance that kept them alive. The Ziggurat-e-Temenanki was gradually abandoned, then pillaged for building materials, then forgotten as a purposeless pile of bricks. The Ishtar Gate was dismantled piece by German archaeologists in the early 20th century and reassembled in Berlin, where it stands today in the Pergamon Museum, shining under artificial lights thousands of kilometers from where it was raised. But something the Hebrews built during those 70 years of exile survived intact to this day. It wasn't made of brick. It wasn't made of blue glaze or bronze or bitumen. It was made of words, the psalms of lament that are still sung in synagogues and churches 3 millennia later. The visions of Ezekiel that are still studied by mystics and theologians seeking to understand the throne of God. The records of Daniel that still generate debates and interpretations about the end of times. The meticulous preservation of the Torah that ensured every letter survived intact from copyist to copyist, from century to century, from continent to continent. The prophets spoke of hope when there was no human reason to hope. Jeremiah, writing before the destruction, already anticipated the return. Isaiah, according to tradition, prophesied Cyrus by name centuries before the Persian was born. Ezekiel saw dry bones coming back to life, a valley of death transformed into an army of the resurrected. It was theology forged in the fire of catastrophe, faith that made sense of suffering without denying that the suffering was real. They were forced to build a city. They chose to preserve a faith. The city turned to dust. The glazed bricks of the Ishtar Gate are in European museums, visited by tourists who photograph without understanding what they're seeing. The foundations of the Etemenanki are holes in the Iraqi desert, excavated and abandoned by archaeology teams expelled by modern wars. The canals silted up and dried centuries ago. The walls that 3 war chariots could traverse side by side at the top are mounds of earth barely distinguishable from the surrounding terrain. But the text those exiles preserved are still read, still sung in the same melodies that were composed on the banks of the rivers of Babylon, still studied in academies and seminaries on 5 continents, still recited in services and masses and Shabbat gatherings by communities that repeat the words scribes copied by lamplight in Babylon, keeping alive a tradition that Nebuchadnezzar thought he had destroyed along with Jerusalem's walls. The king built to impress, the captives built to survive. The bricks lasted centuries, the words lasted millennia, and in the end, only what the captives made survived.